The great station of Axiom Prime hung in the void like a metal god waiting for worship, its spinning rings catching the light of 3 distant suns and throwing it back into the darkness in patterns that had become holy to some species and merely beautiful to others. For 300 years, this place had served as neutral ground where enemies could speak without killing each other, where wars could end before they truly began, and where the 12 great powers of the galaxy pretended to be civilized while their fleets waited hungrily just beyond sensor range. Today, the pretense was wearing thin Ambassador Cyril Voss stood at the entrance of the Great Chamber and watched the delegations arrive with the careful eyes of someone who had seen too many peace summits collapse into declarations of war, and he could feel in his ancient bones that this one balanced on a knife's edge sharper than any before. The Vethkai came first, as they always insisted on doing, their massive forms wrapped in ceremonial armor that could stop plasma fire. Their 4 arms carrying weapons they claimed were traditional, but everyone knew were fully functional. And their leader, High Commander Rethax, walked with the confidence of someone who had personally torn enemies apart with his bare hands and would happily do so again. Behind them came the crystalline hegemony, their silicon-based bodies catching the light and refracting it into rainbows that would have been beautiful if not for the cold calculation in their gemstone eyes. And their speaker, Prism of Truth, moved with the careful precision of a species that had turned patience into a weapon more deadly than any fleet. One by one, the other great powers entered and took their places at the massive circular table that dominated the chamber. And the air grew thick with tension and the smell of a dozen different atmospheric requirements mixing unpleasantly together. The Mindweavers drifted in on their hover platforms, their tentacles twitching with barely contained telepathic energy that made everyone nearby feel slightly violated just by proximity. And Ambassador Thrixel regarded the room with the superior expression of someone who could read every thought, and found them all disappointing. The Eternal Chroniclers sent their oldest representative, Grand Archivist Umeth, whose species had been recording galactic history since before most of the others had discovered fire, and his ancient eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of empires that now existed only as entries in his people's endless archives. The others followed in quick succession, each bringing their own grievances and their own agendas and their own reasons why this summit would surely fail like so many before it. And by the time the chamber was full, the hostility was so thick that Cyril Voss could practically taste it. And then the human arrived. She came alone, which was the first strange thing because no species sent a single representative to a summit this important. And she came without guards, which was the second strange thing because even the chroniclers, who had no enemies, brought protection. And she came in a ship so small it barely registered on the station sensors, which was the third strange thing, because every other delegation had arrived in vessels designed to intimidate. Commander Ilar Chin walked into the great chamber with quiet steps that somehow drew every eye in the room. And she was small by the standards of most species present and plain, by the standards of human beauty, and utterly unremarkable in every way that should have mattered. But something about her made the Vethkai, High Commander's forehands tighten on his weapons. Something about her made the Mindweaver Ambassador stop his casual thought scanning and pull his consciousness back behind his mental shields. Something about her made Grand Archivist Umeth feel for the first time in centuries that he was looking at a page of history that had not yet been written and might be written in blood. She carried only a small black case, and she took her seat at the human delegation's position, which was the smallest and least prestigious spot at the table, and she placed the case before her and folded her hands and waited. No one spoke to her. The summit began with the usual formalities that meant nothing, and everyone knew meant nothing but performed anyway because civilization required its rituals, even when civilization was preparing to tear itself apart. High Commander Rethax presented the Vethkai position, which was that the crystalline Hegemony had been building weapons in violation of 17 different treaties and must be stopped before they threatened the peace of the entire galaxy. Speaker Prism of Truth responded with the hegemony position, which was that the HFY had been expanding into neutral territory for decades, and their accusations were merely a pretext for the war of conquest they had always planned. The accusations flew back and forth, and the other delegations chose their sides, based on old alliances and older hatreds, and the chamber filled with shouting in a dozen languages, while translation systems struggled to keep up with the insults. Through it all, Commander Chen sat in silence. She did not argue for humanity's position, because humanity had no position in this conflict that anyone cared about. She did not offer to mediate because no one had asked the newest and weakest member of the galactic community to mediate anything. She simply watched with eyes that reflected the chamber's lights like dark mirrors and waited for something that only she knew was coming. The breaking point arrived when High Commander Rethax slammed all 4 of his fists on the table, hard enough to crack the ancient wood, and declared that the HFY Dominion would not remain in a summit that protected aggressors and punished the righteous. He turned to leave, and his delegation rose with him, and every diplomat in the room knew that when he walked through those doors, the war would begin and billions would die. Commander Chun opened her case. She did not stand or speak or make any dramatic gesture, and the click of the case's latches was barely audible over the chaos of the moment. But somehow that small sound cut through the noise like a blade through flesh. High Commander Rethax stopped. Every being in the chamber stopped inside the case. Resting on a bed of black velvet was a sphere no larger than a human fist. And it was darker than dark, darker than the void between stars. So dark that looking at it felt like looking at a hole in reality itself. No one knew what it was, but everyone knew with a certainty that bypassed thought and went straight to the oldest and most primitive parts of their brains, that they were looking at death. Death had landed on the peace table, and death wore a human face. The silence lasted for 17 heartbeats by human counting, and, in that silence, every being in the great chamber felt something they had not felt in years or decades, or in some cases centuries. And that something was the cold hand of genuine fear touching the back of their minds. High Commander Rethax did not leave. He turned back to face the table, and his 4 eyes fixed on the small sphere in its black case, and then on the small human woman who sat behind it with her hands folded, and her expression as calm as still water. "What is that thing?" he demanded, and his voice that had been roaring moments ago now came out quieter than he had intended. Commander Chun did not answer. She simply closed the case with another soft click, and the spell broke, and beings began to breathe again, and move again, and pretend that they had not just experienced a moment of primal terror caused by something no larger than a piece of fruit. The summit resumed, but everything had changed in ways that no one could quite explain. Ambassador Cyril Voss watched the proceedings with growing unease, because he had been a diplomat for longer than most species had been spacefaring, and he had never seen a room full of predators become so careful so quickly. And he had never seen a single person command so much attention while doing absolutely nothing. The hours passed and the arguments continued, but they were softer now, less aggressive, as if everyone was afraid of what might happen if voices were raised too high or threats were made too openly. During the first recess, the intelligence officers of every delegation began their work. Within hours, reports started coming back, and they all said the same impossible thing Commander Alara Chun did not exist, or rather she had not existed until exactly 15 years ago, when she appeared fully formed in the classified archives of human military command with a rank and a history that no one could verify, and connections to projects that no one had ever heard of. Before that date, there was nothing. No birth record, no childhood, no family, no education, no career, just a void where a person should have been. And then suddenly there she was, as if someone had written her into reality. With a pen made of secrets, the Mindweaver ambassador decided to take matters into his own mind. Thrixol was old and powerful, and had read the thoughts of kings and generals and beings who believed themselves beyond the reach of telepathy. And he had never encountered a mind he could not at least touch, even if he could not fully penetrate it. He approached Commander Chun during the second recess when she stood alone by a viewing port, looking out at the stars with that same calm expression she had worn since her arrival. He extended his consciousness toward her as gently as he could manage, because there was no reason to be aggressive, when a simple surface scan would tell him everything he needed to know about this mysterious human. His mind touched hers, and Thrixol screamed. The sound that came from the Mindweaver ambassador was not a sound that any of the other delegates had ever heard his species make, and several of them drew weapons before they realized what was happening. And by the time they understood that no attack had occurred, Thrixol was on the floor with his tentacles wrapped around his own head and his body shaking. Commander Chun had not moved. She had not even turned away from the viewing port. It took 4 of his aides to carry Thrixol back to his ship, and when he finally recovered enough to speak, he called his most trusted advisor close and whispered in a voice that trembled like a leaf in a storm. It was like touching the surface of a star. He said, "Vast and burning and so bright it should have blinded me." But the worst part was not the power. The worst part was that there was no fear in her. None at all. Not a single trace of the emotion that every living being carries in some small corner of their soul. She has been emptied of it, hollowed out, and something else has been put in its place. His advisor asked what that something else was. Thrixol could not answer because he did not have words for what he had glimpsed in that brief moment of contact. The other delegations noticed the Mindweaver's condition, and they noticed that Commander Chun continued to stand at her viewing port as if nothing had happened, and they began to whisper among themselves in voices too low for translation systems. To catch Grand Archivist Umeth had lived for over 800 years and had seen things that would drive lesser beings mad. And he had learned long ago that the most dangerous forces in the universe were not the ones that announced themselves with fire and thunder, but the ones that waited in silence until the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. He approached the human when the chamber had emptied for the evening meal that most species required, and humans apparently did not. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall," he said to her without greeting or preamble, because his species considered such things wasteful. "I have seen empires that spanned 1,000 stars crumble to dust in a single generation. I have recorded the deaths of gods and the births of new ones. And in all that time, I have learned to recognize the moments when history changes direction." Commander Chun turned to look at him, and her eyes were dark and deep and utterly unreadable. "What are you?" the archivist asked, "and I do not mean your name or your rank or your species, because those things are obvious. I mean, what are you truly? What function do you serve? What purpose brought you to this place at this moment?" She considered his question for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was soft and almost kind in a way that made the words more terrifying rather than less. "I am what happens when a species learns that the universe will never be safe," she said. "So they become the danger instead." The archivist felt a chill pass through his ancient body. He returned to his quarters and accessed archives that had been sealed for centuries. Archives that contain information so sensitive that only the most senior chroniclers were permitted to know they existed. He searched for any record of humanity before their first contact with the wider galaxy. He found almost nothing because humans were young by galactic standards and had been considered too insignificant to study in detail. But he found one thing, a single encrypted file that had been flagged by chronicler observers during humanity's first diplomatic meeting with an alien species. A file that contained only one phrase repeated in every known language, as if someone had wanted to make absolutely certain that any being who found it would understand. The phrase was simple: "Project Prometheus is active. The fire has been lit. The archivist sat in the darkness of his quarters and felt the weight of that phrase settle on his shoulders like a shroud. And he understood for the first time that he was not watching history change direction. He was watching something that had been in motion for longer than anyone suspected. And the human woman with the black case was merely the visible edge of something vast and terrible that had been waiting in the darkness all along. The second day of the summit began with murder. The body of the crystalline hegemony's ambassador was found shattered into 1,000 pieces in his private quarters. And the manner of death was unmistakably Vethkai, because only their species possessed the strength to break silicon-based life forms into fragments so small within an hour the hegemony fleet waiting beyond the station's sensor range had powered up their weapons and begun moving into attack formation. And the Vethkai fleet had responded in kind, and every other delegation was scrambling to contact their own military forces. High Commander Rethax denied all involvement with a fury that seemed genuine but changed nothing because the evidence was clear and the hegemony was not interested in excuses. The summit dissolved into chaos. Delegates fled to their ships to escape before the shooting started. Advisors screamed into communication devices trying to arrange last-minute alliances. And the carefully maintained peace of 300 years crumbled in the span of a single morning. Ambassador Cyril Voss stood in the center of the great chamber and watched everything he had dedicated his life to building fall apart around him. And he wondered if this was how it always ended, with blood and accusations and the terrible momentum of war that no single being could stop once it began. Commander Chun remained in her seat. She had not moved since the news of the murder broke, and her black case sat before her unopened. And her expression had not changed by even a fraction of a degree. The first assassination attempt came at midday. A Vethkai agent, disguised as a maintenance worker, tried to plant an explosive device in the quarters of the Mindweaver delegation. Perhaps hoping to draw another species into the conflict, or perhaps simply following orders from commanders who had already decided that total war was inevitable. The agent was found dead in a service corridor with no visible wounds and no explanation for how his heart had simply stopped beating. The second assassination attempt came 2 hours later. A hegemony operative attempted to poison the water supply of the neutral station itself, an act of terrorism that would have killed thousands of beings from dozens of species and turned the entire galaxy against the crystalline people. The operative was found dead in the water processing facility with her weapons still holstered and her poison still sealed in its container, and the same mysterious absence of any cause of death. The third assassination attempt came as the sun set on the station's artificial day cycle. 3 separate kill teams from 3 separate species converged on the chambers of Ambassador Cyril Voss himself, perhaps believing that eliminating the last voice for peace would free their governments to pursue war without diplomatic complications. All 9 assassins were found dead in the corridors outside his door, arranged in a neat row as if someone had taken the time to position them carefully, and each one had died without a struggle and without leaving any evidence of who or what had killed them. Security footage showed nothing. Sensors detected nothing, but every single delegate who had been targeted reported the same thing when questioned by their own intelligence services. In the moment before their would-be killers died, they had glimpsed Commander Chun somewhere in their field of vision, standing in a doorway or passing through a corridor or simply visible through a window across the station. She had never moved toward the assassins. She had never drawn a weapon. She had simply been there, and then the assassins had been dead. Fear spread through Axiom Prime like a plague. Beings who had come to the station prepared for war found themselves terrified of Something far worse than war. Something they could not see or understand or fight. Something that killed without trace and protected without being asked, and seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. And once High Commander Rethax had never known fear in his long and bloody life. He had fought in 17 campaigns and killed enemies with every weapon his species had ever invented and torn the throats from beings twice his size with his bare hands and laughed while doing it. But when he demanded answers from the human delegation and found himself standing before Commander Chun with his personal guards surrounding her and his rage burning in his chest, he felt something cold moving through his blood. "What are you?" he roared. And his voice echoed through the chamber, where only a handful of delegates remained, because the others had already fled. "What game does humanity play here? What trick have your people invented to make fools of us all?" Commander Chun looked up at him, and her dark eyes met his without flinching. "No game," she said, and her voice was soft as falling snow. "No trick. Just a simple truth that your species and all the others have not yet understood." She rose from her seat, and she was so small compared to the massive Vethkai warrior that she barely reached his chest. But somehow in that moment she seemed larger than the room itself. "Humanity learned something when we first looked up at the stars," she said. "We learned that the universe is vast and cold, and filled with things that would destroy us without a second thought. We learned that peace is a lie that powerful beings tell to weaker ones while preparing their knives. We learned that no one would protect us, because no one ever protects the small and the weak and the young." She opened her case. The black sphere rose from its velvet bed and hung in the air between them, spinning slowly, and its darkness seemed to drink the light from the room until shadows gathered in corners that had been bright moments before. "So we made a choice," Commander Chun continued. "We would not hope for safety. We would not pray for peace. We would not wait for the universe to show us mercy, because the universe has no mercy to give." The sphere pulsed once with something that was not light. Every system on the station went dark. Every sensor stopped functioning. Every weapon powered down. Every ship in range lost navigation and communication and life support for exactly 3 seconds. When the power returned and beings stopped screaming and the chaos settled into trembling silence, every delegate in the room found a message waiting on their personal devices. The messages contained coordinates. Home coordinates for their species, locations of their families, precise positions of their most important military assets. Information that should have been impossible to obtain and was now sitting in their hands like a death sentence. "This is a Prometheus device," Commander Chun said, and the sphere returned to its case as gently as a sleeping child being laid in a bed. "There are others. You will never find them. You will never know where they are, but they are watching. Always." She closed the case with a soft click that sounded like a door closing on the future everyone had expected. "We became the thing that other nightmares fear," she said. "Because someone had to, because the alternative was extinction. Because humanity decided that if the universe would not let us live in peace, then we would become the silence that forces peace upon it." High Commander Rethax stood before her with his 4 hands trembling. For the first time in his life, he understood now. They all understood humanity had not come to this summit as a minor species, seeking a seat at the table of galactic powers. They had come as the blade pressed against every throat, and they had been holding that blade for far longer than anyone had ever suspected. The great chamber had never been so quiet. The remaining delegates sat in their places with the stillness of prey animals who have realized that a predator walks among them. And the fear in the room was so thick it seemed to have weight and substance. High Commander Rethax had returned to his seat with movements that no longer carried the confidence of a warrior but the caution of someone walking Through a minefield in the dark, the hegemony delegates who had been screaming for war an hour ago now sat with their crystalline bodies dimmed to the faintest glow, as if trying to become invisible. Even the Mindweaver ambassador had returned, despite his earlier trauma. His tentacles wrapped tight around his body as he watched Commander Chun with eyes that held equal parts terror and desperate curiosity. Grand Archivist Umeth broke the silence because his species had learned long ago that truth served better than ignorance, no matter how terrible that truth might be. You said there are others, he said, and his ancient voice carried through the chamber like a whisper in a tomb. Others like you, others with these devices. How many? Where are they? How long has this been happening? Commander Chun considered the question with the same calm she had shown since her arrival. The same patience that now seemed less like diplomacy and more like the patience of a hunter who knows that running prey always tire eventually. I will tell you everything, she said, because you deserve to understand what guards your sleep and what price was paid for the peace you have enjoyed without knowing its true source. She stood and walked to the center of the chamber, where a holographic display waited for diplomatic presentations, and she activated it with a gesture that brought up a star map showing the entire known galaxy. 15 years ago, humanity made first contact with the wider universe. She began. We had dreamed of that moment for centuries. We had imagined friendly aliens who would welcome us into a community of peaceful species. We had hoped that reaching the stars would mean reaching a better future. The map shifted to show the territories of the 12 great powers, their borders marked in different colors that overlapped and conflicted in dozens of disputed regions. What we found instead was a universe at war. A universe that had always been at war and would always be at war. Every species we encountered told us the same story. Civilizations rise and expand and inevitably come into conflict with each other. The strong consume the weak, empires fall, billions die. And then the cycle begins again. She highlighted several dark regions on the map where no species currently claimed territory. These were once home to thriving civilizations. The Xanthari Confederation controlled 12 worlds. The Burning Choir had colonies across an entire arm of the galaxy. The Silent Ones built structures that still drift through space as monuments to their forgotten glory. All of them gone now, all of them lost to the cycle of rise and war and extinction. The delegates shifted uncomfortably because they all knew those empty regions and had always assumed they represented natural gaps in colonization or mysteries too old to solve. Humanity studied this pattern, Commander Chun continued. We analyzed every historical record we could find. We modeled the trajectories of every known civilization, and we reached a conclusion that changed everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. She paused, and her dark eyes swept the chamber. The conclusion was simple. Peace through goodwill is impossible. Treaties fail because circumstances change, and old agreements become inconvenient. Alliances collapse because interests diverge and former friends become enemies. Diplomacy delays conflict, but never prevents it because every species ultimately acts in its own interest when survival is at stake. High Commander Rethax found his voice, though it came out weaker than he intended. Then what is the answer if not diplomacy, if not treaties? If not the structures we have built to manage our differences? The answer, Commander Chun said, is consequence, absolute and inescapable consequence for aggression. A price so high that no victory could ever be worth paying it. She touched the holographic display, and 12 points of light appeared scattered across the map, positioned in ways that seemed random until you realized that each one sat within striking distance of every major power. Project Prometheus was born from that understanding. We took volunteers, soldiers who understood what they would become and chose it anyway. And we transformed them into something new. something that had never existed before in the history of intelligent life. The display showed a human figure wrapped in shadow with data scrolling alongside it. Medical readings and enhancement specifications, and capability assessments that made even the HFY warriors 4 hard skip beats. We removed their fear because fear causes hesitation, and hesitation causes failure. We enhanced their bodies beyond the limits of natural biology. We extended their lifespans until age became meaningless. We trained them in every form of combat and infiltration and strategic thinking that human history had ever produced. She closed her hand and the display vanished. We created 12 of us. The Prometheus operatives, the Silent Guardians. The weapons that humanity would never admit to possessing, and that no other species would ever see coming. Grand Archivist Umeth asked the question that burned in every mind present. What have you done with this power? What have the 12 of you been doing for 15 years while the rest of the galaxy remained ignorant? We have been watching, Commander Chun answered. We have been embedded in every major civilization, hidden in plain sight, monitoring for threats to galactic stability and eliminating them before they can grow into wars. She turned to face the HFY delegation directly. The assassins who tried to kill Ambassador Voss did not die by accident. They died because they threatened the peace, and the Prometheus Protocol does not permit threats to peace. She turned to the hegemony survivors. The operative who tried to poison the station did not die by coincidence. She died because mass murder of civilians crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. And the Zentari Confederation, Grand Archivist Umeth said slowly as terrible understanding dawned in his ancient eyes. The civilization that vanished 60 years ago without explanation, without survivors, without any trace of what happened to 12 worlds and 18 billion beings. Commander Chun's expression did not change. The Zentari developed a weapon capable of sterilizing entire star systems. They intended to use it preemptively against species they considered threats. They were warned. They did not listen. The silence that followed was the silence of beings confronting a truth too large to process. You killed them, the Archivist whispered. All of them, 18 billion. We removed a threat to galactic peace, Commander Chun replied without emotion. We ensured that no species would ever face extinction at Zentari hands. We made an example that we hoped would prevent future conflicts from escalating to that point. The Mindweaver Ambassador's telepathic voice entered every mind simultaneously. The Burning Choir, the Silent Ones, the other empty regions on the map. How many civilizations have you ended in the name of your peace? Enough, Commander Chun said. Enough to ensure that the others learned the lesson. Enough to prove that aggression has a cost that cannot be avoided or bargained away or survived. She returned to her seat and sat with her hands folded over her black case. We are not conquerors, she said quietly. Humanity has no empire to build and no ideology to spread. We do not care who rules what territory or which species dominates which region of space. We care only that the wars stop, that the cycle of endless destruction ends, that something survives long enough to become better than what came before. High Commander Rethax stared at the small human woman who had just confessed to genocide on a scale that made his species' bloodiest wars seem like minor skirmishes. You are monsters, he said. Yes. Commander Chun agreed without hesitation. We are exactly that. We chose to become monsters because the alternative was watching the universe tear itself apart. We chose to bear the weight of terrible acts so that others would not have to. We chose to be the nightmare that keeps worse nightmares at bay. She met his gaze with eyes that held no guilt and no regret and no doubt. The question now is whether you want to test whether we were bluffing. Whether you want to discover firsthand what happens when a species decides that war is worth the price. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression any being in that chamber had ever witnessed. I promise you. High Commander, it is not worth the price. Nothing is worth the price, and by the time you understand that truth, it will be far too late to matter. The summit resumed 3 days later. The fleets that had been moving toward battle stations had retreated to their home territories, and the accusations of murder had been quietly dropped when investigations revealed that the crystalline ambassador had been killed by a third party hoping to start exactly the war that had nearly erupted. The great chamber was full again, but the atmosphere had transformed completely. Where there had been hostility and posturing and barely contained aggression, there was now only careful politeness and the desperate cooperation of beings who had glimpsed the alternative and found it utterly unacceptable. High Commander Rethax presented the Vethkai position, which was now that territorial disputes could be resolved through arbitration, and that the Dominion would welcome neutral observers to verify their compliance with existing treaties. Speaker Prism of Truth, who had taken over for the murdered ambassador, presented the hegemony position, which was now that all weapons of mass destruction would be destroyed under international supervision, and that the crystalline people sought only peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. One by one, the other delegations made similar declarations. The Mindweavers would cease their unauthorized telepathic surveillance of other species. The aggressive expansion that had defined Vethkai policy for centuries would end immediately. Border disputes that had simmered for generations were resolved in hours through compromises that would have been unthinkable a week ago. The new galactic concord that emerged from those negotiations was stronger than anything the galaxy had ever known. Not because the species involved had suddenly developed goodwill toward each other, but because they had all looked into the eyes of something that made their ancient hatreds seem petty, and small Commander Chun observed it all without comment. She had not spoken since her revelation in the chamber 3 days ago, had not needed to speak because her silence said everything that needed to be said. When the final documents were signed, and the delegates began preparing to return to their homeworlds, several of them approached her privately. High Commander Rethax came first and stood before her with his forearms hanging at his sides in a posture of submission that his species had not displayed to anyone in recorded history. "I do not forgive you for what you have done," he said. "I do not accept that the deaths of billions can ever be justified, no matter how many future deaths they might prevent. But I understand now why you did it, and I will ensure that my people never give you cause to do it again, Commander." Chun nodded once in acknowledgement. Speaker Prism of Truth came next, and their crystalline body pulsed with colors that indicated deep emotional conflict. "My predecessor would have started a war that killed trillions," they said. "I see now that his death was not murder, but prevention. I do not know how to feel about owing the survival of my species to beings I would have called enemies yesterday, but I will carry that debt and ensure it is never forgotten." Commander Chun nodded again. Grand Archivist Umath came last, and his ancient face was lined with exhaustion and something that might have been grief or might have been acceptance of truths too large for comfort. "I will record this summit in our eternal chronicles," he said, "but I confess I do not know how to describe what has happened here. Are you heroes or villains, saviors or tyrants, the guardians of peace or the murderers of civilizations?" Commander Chun considered his question for a long moment before she answered. "We are none of those things and all of them," she said. "We are the hand that holds the blade to the throat of oblivion. We are the price that must be paid for a future that might otherwise never exist. We are humanity's gift to a universe that never asked for our help and will never thank us for providing it." She picked up her black case and prepared to leave. "Record us however you wish, Grand Archivist. Call us what you will. It does not matter to us what we are called, because names and judgments are luxuries for those who have the privilege of being innocent. We gave up that privilege long ago so that others would not have to." She walked toward the exit of the great chamber and paused at the threshold to look back at the gathered delegations one final time. The peace you have made today is real," she said. "Honor it and you will never see us again. Break it and you will discover that what happened to the Zinthari was not the limit of what we are willing to do, but merely the beginning." And then she was gone. Grand Archivist Umeth returned to his ship and sat alone in his quarters for many hours trying to find the words to describe what he had witnessed. In the end, he wrote simply this: "They are the hand that holds the blade to the throat of oblivion. They do not ask for gratitude. They do not seek forgiveness. They are humanity, the species that looked into the abyss and decided that if the universe would not grant them peace, they would become the silence that forces it." He saved the entry and closed his archives and hoped that no future chronicler would ever have cause to add to what he had written. Commander Alara Chun returned to her small ship and set a course for the next crisis point that the Prometheus network had identified. Another dispute between species who had not yet learned that war was no longer an option they could afford. Before she entered cryosleep for the long journey, she allowed herself one small moment of humanity. She retrieved a photograph from a hidden compartment. A picture of a family standing on green grass under a blue sky. A woman and a man and a small girl with dark eyes and a bright smile. The woman in the photograph looked nothing like Alara Chun because that woman had existed before Project Prometheus. Before the enhancements and the training and the hollowing out of everything that had once made her human. She traced the outline of the child's face with a finger that could kill in 17 different ways without leaving a mark. "Elena," she whispered, speaking the name of a daughter she had not seen in 15 years and would never see again because operatives did not have families and weapons did not have children, and the price of being humanity's guardian was giving up everything that made being human worthwhile. She put the photograph away and sealed the compartment and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the darkness of space, the other 11 operatives were doing the same thing. Watching over civilizations that would never know their names. Protecting species that would curse them if they ever learned the truth. Carrying the weight of terrible choices so that the universe might survive long enough to become something better. They were the silent guardians. They were the monsters humanity had chosen to become. They were the peace that death brings, and somewhere in the endless void between stars, a small human ship moved quietly toward its destination while its occupant dreamed of a life she had sacrificed and a child who had grown up without her, and a blue-green world that she protected from a distance but could never call home again. The universe slept safely that night because something dangerous guarded the dark, and it wore a human face. The end.